Welcome to Don't Quote Me on That. One day we will have an intro, but today is not that day.
Hello, hello, hello. I'm Kay, and welcome back to Don't Quote Me on That, where we kind of talk about movies. And we this week, if you can see and hear in the background, is a little kitten that I have got in my house. It's playtime for him, so we are going to hear him jingling around. He might jump in and attack me. He seems to think when I sit on the floor, that's an invitation to play. So I apologize in advance for the jingling, but if you are watching this, cute little friend we have this week, Cat Tax, or whatever. Last week we talked about my favorite pieces of media from 2016, so movies and music. So I thought I would bring it back to the present for this week's episode and talk about all the books I've read so far this year. A few years ago, I started my current reading journey that I'm on because between high school and college, I just didn't really have the time nor the desire to read for fun. And it was something that once I finished college and I was a few years out and kind of, I think, had established a routine in my life, something I wanted to get back into. I was a pretty avid, voracious, insatiable reader growing up. Read anything I get my hands on. My mom banned reading at the dinner table to tell you how often I had my face in a book. So I started my reading journey a few years ago, and I started out by just aiming to read 12 books for the year. I figured one book a month isn't too crazy of a stretch, nice and easy way to ease myself back into it, like setting too high of an expectation on myself. And then I think the following year I went up to 24, 25 books, so 2 books a month essentially. And last year my reading goal was 50 books for the year. I made it by the skin of my teeth. I read, I think, 3 70-page books on December 31st. So my reading goal for this year is also 50 books. I really wanted it to be 75, but given that I had such a hard time hitting 50 last year, I decided let me not stress myself out, and then I'd be really upset if I didn't hit 75 this year. Let me hit 50 because I know it's an achievable number. Hopefully hit it a bit more comfortably this year and even exceed it, and then next year we can maybe think about 60, 70 books. And I just wanted to share a few reading tips that I have used in this reading journey that have helped me read more, I think become a more engaged and present reader as well, but also just helped my reading journey be sustainable. Number one is the setting goals and setting realistic goals. Like I said, I read 50 books last year, just reset that goal at 50. I think it's very easy, especially online in the booktube, bookstagram, book talk spaces, to get caught up in these reading wrap-ups people do when they're like, I read 20 books this month. And it's like, some people are lucky if they can read 20 books in a year. Some people are lucky if they can read 5 books in a year. Just picking up a book is in itself an achievement. And I do think that sort of gets lost in these online spaces and in the online community. Realistic goals, I think, are really important, not comparing yourself. 2 things that I've really highlighted recently that have really helped me is changing genre every time I read a new book. And it's not every time, it's not perfect. If I'm reading a series, usually I'll try and read the series back to back to back. So I'll obviously be in the same genre for that stretch of time. But I make an effort to read a lot of different genres, especially ones that I'm not necessarily interested in, because I think that's a way to improve yourself, diversify your palette, and you're going to learn things about yourself in regard to what you don't like, or you might surprise yourself and find something you thought you didn't like, and now you do. So I try to change genre. I'll read a memoir, I'll read a fantasy, I'll read a romance, just bebop around, and even within those genres, I'll find different subgenres to engage with. And I use Storygraph to track my reading. So this year, actually, I signed up for a Storygraph challenge, which is to read 6 memoirs / autobiographies / biographies for the year. I'm at 2 right now, so I've got 6 months to read 4 more. So I don't think that'll be too difficult. But little things like that, even just a little mini challenge that it's an arbitrary number, 6. Someone else said it for me, but it does challenge me when I'm not sure what to read next. I've got a long TBR. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll pick up the autobiography on that list instead of something else because I know I have a goal I'm trying to hit. Another thing that I've identified really in the last couple of weeks even is reading on my Kindle versus reading physical books. When I started my reading journey, I was reading almost exclusively on the Kindle because I didn't live at home and I traveled a ton. So rather than lugging books around, it's obviously much easier to just have them all on the Kindle. But I started reading a physical book recently that I take with me when I go to the beach or the pool or something. And I can feel the difference in the amount of information I absorb and retain in that physical book versus the books I read on my Kindle. I have a really hard time remembering the plot and details of what I've read, even if I remember I like them. So this is also part of the reason I'm doing this video, is to force me to engage a little bit more with the stuff that I'm reading. And it's also why I use Storygraph, because I make myself write a review for every book I read in an effort to make sure I really retained something and got something out of the book rather than just skimming words on a page to say that I read a book, because I think those are two very different experiences. I also think in terms of switching the format in which you're reading, you could include audiobooks in here. I personally am not an audiobook person, but I would recommend, if audiobooks are for you, switching up the way you consume books, because I don't think someone should only listen to audiobooks. I don't think someone should only read on their Kindle. I don't think someone should only read physical books. I do think a mix is good. As much as I would love it to be, this is not sponsored by Storygraph, but as I mentioned, I do use it a lot, and mostly just to hold myself accountable. I don't really keep up with anyone on there. But if you wanted to check out what I'm reading and see some of my reviews and maybe get some ideas for your TBR, my Storygraph is at Don't Quote K on that. Okay, getting into the meat and potatoes of today's episode is all the books I have read this year so far. I am at 24 books. I'm currently reading number 25, so I think pretty good pacing wise. I'm halfway through my reading goal. We're halfway through the year. Hopefully I would like to pick up the pace just a little bit in the next couple of months because it's summer. So hopefully I have, like, a little bit more free time, a little bit more leisure time to sit around and read a few more books so I can get a little bit past my goal of 50. The first book I read this year is called My Heart is a Chainsaw, and it is by Stephen Graham Jones. I will read anything that Stephen Graham Jones writes. This is book number 1 in the Indian Lake trilogy, and I do believe this book and this series is his most popular set of work. I personally like the other 2 books I've read by him, which is The Only Good Indians and The Buffalo Hunter, just because, we'll get into it, some of specifically the protagonist in My Heart is a Chainsaw. And I'm also very interested in how it is a trilogy based on how the first book ends, so I might give the rest of the trilogy a go just because I'm curious about how that story ends up continuing into not only one book but 2 more. My Heart is a Chainsaw follows Jade, who is a slasher film obsessed high school senior living in a small town that is in the process of being developed or gentrified. A series of events occurs in the town that Jade takes note of, and it kind of is on her checklist of how a slasher film begins. And she's really, really excited to be in her favorite genre and also maybe see the town get some of the comeuppance that she thinks it deserves. And she becomes enmeshed with one of the town's being developed by these 4 or 5 rich families, and the daughter of one of these families, Jade believes, is going to be the final girl in this slasher film that is becoming her life. She gets really enmeshed with this girl, and as the story goes on, she eventually has to confront not only the slasher and not only the final girl, but also the terrifying realities of her past. I hope that made you want to read it because it was really good. My first note, and part of the reason I like The Only Good Indians and The Buffalo Hunter better than this, is because of the protagonist. And that's not to say I didn't like Jade, because I really did. She had a lot of heart. She was also a reluctant hero, which I liked. I feel like a lot of times in media that deals with teenagers, and just in media in general nowadays, we get a lot of what I call main character syndrome, and I'm sure there's an actual term for this, but it's this many things can't happen to one person, and they can't be so willing to take on all of this responsibility all the time. They're so gung-ho, and they're it is hard, but it's for the greater good. Jade's not like that. Jade wanted no part in the story. Jade wanted to be an observer in her town as the slasher killed everybody, but she did not want to be a key player of any sort. She just wanted to watch it play out how she thought it should play out. But because she was a teenage protagonist and she was experiencing some teen angst, which if you have read the book, I know that's reducing what she's going through a lot. I just can't think of a better way to phrase it. Especially in the beginning of the book, she's just going through so much teen angst of nobody understands me and being an outcast. It's just not something I can relate to personally now. And even as the story went on, she got a lot more depth. I understood where she was coming from and where that teen angst was stemming from. But it's just personally a lot harder for me to relate to a character like that than, say, the characters in those other 2 books. Jade is also so unself-aware and aware that a teenager is well within their rights to be, but that for me also personally, I don't like when characters have a hard time admitting things to themselves. And there was one really major thing that Jade was not revealed to us, but was hinted at throughout the book. And again, I am doing the reduction of the plot here just for me personally. Not that it was bad, it just didn't gel as well with me as some other stories could have. But it did work. Her not being aware of herself really made the whole slasher film thing work because she so badly didn't want to be a part of it, and then by the time she realized she was a part of it, she was too far in it to not be a part of it, if that makes sense. And I also really liked that every chapter was intercut with like school assignments Jade did, and Jade's whole thing is she loves slasher films so much she cannot stay on topic, so she's writing essays for history class and somehow always relates back to a slasher film. It never really like hits the point of the project. We learn a lot about the genre, we learn a lot about how Jade compartmentalizes or views things in her life and why she uses that lens. And I think having the framework of horror films to work off of and having it explained to us so simply in the book really worked in terms of the side characters, because there was quite a few of them, both like central to the plot and on the outskirts of the plot. And by having them reduced to almost these tropes, it simplified the book so you didn't get too lost and you could kind of follow the path that Stephen Graham Jones was laying out for you without oversimplifying the characters. And also it works really well because Stephen Graham Jones has such a gift to take a story in a way you never expected. And so by using these tropes, we think we're following one path and he takes us down a completely different one. And again, I will read anything Stephen Graham Jones writes. I think he is a master of horror. He's probably my favorite author right now. And if you have a chance, I would recommend picking up any of his books. Again, highly recommend The Only Good Indians and The Buffalo Hunter. That is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, and I rated it 3 stars. I do think I rated The Only Good Indians 4 stars and The Buffalo Hunter 5. So, second book I read this year was Brooklyn by Colm Tobin, and I rated this 4 stars. And this has been on my this had been on my TBR for a long time because I love the movie. It stars Saoirse Ronan. It's from, I actually don't remember what year, but I do think this is one of the few rare cases where the movie is better than the book, although I'm a little bit biased. I've just seen the movie so many times, and it just made one slight change at the end of the book that I personally preferred, so I would rate the movie, but the book is very good. Brooklyn is about Ellis, who's a young Irish woman and she moves to Brooklyn in the 1950s, and she basically ends up grappling with adulthood and love and homesickness and loss of culture and grief. And I always say that although Brooklyn has such a beautiful love story in it, it is not a love story. It is really truly like a coming-of-age story about Ellis, but in it she falls in love with this young Italian-American man named Tony, and I really like their relationship because in it you get to see like a microcosm, I guess, of all the themes and topics and issues that Ellis faces in her day-to-day life. So the ideas of homesickness and the ideas of love and the ideas of grief and coming into adulthood, all of those are reflected in a variety of ways throughout her life, but they're all reflected directly in her relationship with Tony. Pacing wise, this was a medium pace. I thought it was very digestible. Colm Tobin has a very good writing style, so while the book was longer than I was expecting it to be, especially based on what was taking place in the movie, it didn't feel long, and I only ranked it as medium pace because there was so much story we went through. But if we had cut off the plot any earlier, I would have said it was fast because it did go by pretty quickly. I also think one thing that makes the story so beautiful is that it's a coming of age story, so it's got a lot of general themes that can be identified with, but it also relates to such a specific experience of growing up and trying to find yourself and become a person in a foreign place. And that is something that I have dealt with personally, so I do think this story maybe hits a little bit harder for me than it would for the average reader. But I went to college in Ireland, and so I spent the first few years of my adult life living away from home, and I really love how this book represented, I suppose, the idea of once you leave home, your home is never a physical place anymore. Like, you can go back to it, but it's not the same place you left. And I know a lot of people have that experience just going off to college or moving away or whatever. As you get older, home is not a physical place, and you can never really truly return to your childhood. But it was just done so beautifully. He also writes so beautifully in this book, and it's not flowery. I find a lot of times when people say, oh, this is written so beautifully, to me it gets a little too fanciful. This was so grounded in reality, but just represented everything like you're looking at life through rose-colored glasses. So maybe it's a little bit better than it actually is, but it's not completely detached from reality. But that was Brooklyn. I gave it 4 stars. I'd recommend reading it if you don't want to go on that journey. I would definitely still recommend watching the movie. The third book I read this year was Competitive Grieving by Nora Zelavansky. And this is about a woman named Ren and her childhood best friend, who's also an up-and-coming or just made it actor, dies. and she ends up getting roped into helping sort through his things, and she has to deal with other people that he was close to in his life, including his very handsome lawyer. And as she grieves, she has to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the version of him his other friends seem to have known instead. And I really enjoyed the end of this book. The last, I'd say 40 to 30%, really brought up some interesting conversations, specifically around you cannot truly know all of a person, and also how or who gets to decide how someone is grieved or remembered. Because 3 different people could meet me and they're never going to experience the same version of me, but that doesn't make any one of their versions less true or correct than the others. And Ren, as this man's best friend, for a lot of the book seemed to feel like she had a monopoly on that, and it was something she grappled with. She wasn't like self-righteous about it, but she did judge very harshly how he was remembered by other people, especially the people that she didn't know or didn't like that well. And I will say that the characters she was dealing with, the other people who were helping go through the dead best friends things, were like cartoonishly insufferable, but somehow Nora Zelavansky managed to, at the end, turn them into real people. And we went on that journey with Ren, which I really liked. Is I thought, oh my god, these aren't real people, I can't believe they're doing this, which is what Ren was thinking. And then by the end, we had grown, and Ren realized just because that's not the person I experienced, or that's not the way my best friend showed up for me, does not mean that's not the way he showed up for those people, and their experiences are just as valid as mine, and I'm wrong for putting any sort of judgment on there. And at the end, I was like, I am wrong for judging these people for wanting to hold on to random t-shirts and random photos that they have no right to, because who am I to say they have no right to them? I thought the romance was unnecessary. I don't know why she had to fall in love with a handsome lawyer. I don't know why the handsome lawyer couldn't have just been like another good friend of her dead best friends that just happened to be there. It was cute enough. I was rooting for them, but I would have preferred if we had just taken all of those like topics and things we dissected in that last 40% and just spread that out throughout the book and kind of scrapped the romance. You can have a hot lawyer and you can feel bad about thinking your dead best friend's lawyer is hot. We don't have to fall in love with him, you know? But that was Competitive Grieving by Nora Zelavansky. I rated it 3 stars just because the first half was fine, like nothing to write home about. And also I just thought the romance was unnecessary. But I think if it had spent a little less time delving into those and had gotten into the topics I liked a little bit sooner, I would have bumped it up to 4 stars. And I don't really believe in half-star ratings, otherwise maybe it would have been like a 3.5, so more on the positive side of neutral. The 4th book I read this year also dealt with death, and that is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. I ranked this 3 stars as well, and that is solely because of the pacing of this book. Burial Rites is based on the true story of the last woman sentenced to death in Iceland. Her name is Agnes, and she was accused of murdering her former boss. While she's on death row, essentially, she's sent to live with a local family because they didn't have prison space for her. They couldn't get her to the prison, something along those lines. So she's sent to live with a local family, and we get basically the story of her life in those last few months, I believe, through a few different POVs. We get Agnes's POV, we get the point of view of the priest that was assigned to her on death row, and then one of the family members within the household that she's imprisoned in, but also is working for, so they kind of use her as an extra set of hands on the farm that they have. I liked this, and I also didn't like it for similar reasons. I liked how it brought to life a real life story. However, I do think at times where the gap had to be bridged between what actually happened, what we factually know happened to Agnes, Magnus' daughter is her name, and what the author thinks happened, I felt like I had to stretch my belief a bit too much. I also felt like it took us down some paths that were unnecessary to the story and could have been cut out. And the book was long, and I think if we had cut out some of those pieces that I found to be unnecessary, it wouldn't have felt like such a drag, because it did feel like a drag reading at times. But the story felt very present and very real and very like it was happening almost, and it made you wish as a reader that the outcome of the book, like the end of the book, would be different, even though going into it you know what's going to happen. She's going to die. This reminds me a little bit of a book I read last year that was one of my top books of the year, and that was What Made Maddie Run, and that was a memoir about this college runner, this high school runner turned college runner who ended up taking her own life. And it was written in such a visceral way that you were rooting for Maddie to turn around and find joy in life and running again and not end her life. But it's a true story, and she did, and there was nothing you, and it was just still so, even going into it knowing the ending, I was still so devastated reading the end of that book. And I kind of felt that way here, a little less so because I was a little bit more detached from Agnes, but still just devastating that that is how her life ended. And I do think in the book it's not really clear whether or not she did it, and Agnes expresses a lot of guilt throughout this book, and you're not really sure if it's guilt about killing this man or guilt over the situation she's in, or guilt in the, like, what the guilt is around. But it's like almost another character's, Agnes's guilt that she lives with. And so while it's not, I think, to me 1000% clear whether or not she did it, her complicated feelings around guilt make a very compelling case for her. That was Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, 3 stars. Interesting read. Next up, I'm going to talk about 2 books. This is the 5th and 8th book I read, and I'm just going to talk about them together because they are part of a duology. It's the 1st and 2nd book in the Jasad Heir series, I guess it's called. And this is, the first book is The Jasad Heir by Sarah Hashem. This is an Egyptian-inspired fantasy that is following the heir of the destroyed kingdom of Jasad, Sylvia, as she becomes the chosen fighter for the heir of Nizal, Aaron. And Nizal is the kingdom that essentially burned down and brought the end of her family and her home. She has to engage in trials, but also battle suspicion and her own magic in an attempt to, one, free herself from having to be on the run, but also decide what it is she is willing to take a stand for. And my favorite part of this book was towards the end, or not towards the end, but there's a quote in the book where she says basically that most people were afraid of what they would do, but I was afraid of what I wouldn't do, like what I was willing to stand by and let happen, essentially. And throughout the book, Sylvia has to put her foot down. She knows what's right and she knows what she cares about, but taking the step to take action to protect those things she cares about is a really big deal for her, especially because she's spent so much of her life now hiding, not wanting to stick out, not wanting to stand up for anything, because then it would make her an obvious target. And so it was really fun to see that journey. I have some mixed feelings about the romance in this book. This is an enemies to lovers, and while I do think it was a bit more believable and better paced than some enemies to lovers that I encounter, and I do truly believe that they were enemies, a lot of times in enemies to lovers it's like academic rivals to lovers, or like this guy that kind of annoys me sometimes, and to lovers, they were truly enemies because they are from warring kingdoms. They're from a kingdom that shouldn't exist and a kingdom that wants it to be eradicated entirely. However, there were times where I felt like their change in feeling was a little rapid. I do like that we got to see a change in feeling over time. It wasn't just one day they hate each other, the next day they're madly in love and think the other person's the hottest person on earth. There were like steps in between. I just wish there were a few more steps in between, because it just kind of felt like at times we were, because the genre of the book and the trope was enemies to lovers, we were meant to assume that they were changing their feelings about each other. It did also help that towards the end we got the male love interests, or the male main character's point of view, so we kind of got to see how his feelings changed, so then it didn't feel so one-sided, so then it didn't feel so out of place when they eventually decided that they loved each other. Also, something that I really liked is that I didn't think the plot of the book was dependent solely on the love story, which I feel like a lot of times in these romantasy type books it is. Yes, she wouldn't have necessarily gone on such a journey and encountered the same people she did if she had not encountered Aaron, the heir of Nizal. Also, his name is spelled Arin, and I keep pronouncing it as like the name Aaron, and I don't think that's right, but I also don't know how else to pronounce it. So, Aaron. But I think because we got to see her do a lot of inner work in regard to what she was willing to fight for and being willing to take a step forward and say what she was willing to fight for, she would have gotten to that eventually. It just might have taken a lot longer. One thing that did cause me to only rank this 3 stars instead of 4 is I hated how Sarah Hashem introduced some side characters. There was like 3 or 4 times where Sarah was discussing Sylvia's mom, her dead mom, And I thought we were talking about 3 or 4 different characters, because sometimes she'd introduce her by her title, sometimes she'd introduce her by her name, sometimes she'd say, "Oh, my mom," if we're from Sylvia's point of view. And I just thought it was really confusing, and she did that quite a few times for quite a few different characters. It also just read a little YA at times, and I could not decide if it was meant to be YA or not. And then they get not super graphic, not graphic at all really, but they get a little steamy towards the end, so I decided I don't think it's YA, but I did read a little YA at times, so I do think this is probably, I imagine this is probably like a good transition book out of YA when you're at the right age for that. But just for me, I'm a little bit older, so YA doesn't always hit. The ending of the Jasad Heir, which is the book we are talking about, was a little stressful. I understand why it had to happen. Good, reasonable. It didn't feel like a cliffhanger or a plot point made just for the sake of shock value, but it stressed me out a little bit. I had a long hold on Libby, which I use when I read books on my Kindle, for the Jasad Crown, which is the sequel and conclusion to the duology. And I also ranked that 3 stars. And in this one, Sylvia, so basically at the end of the last book, Sylvia and Aaron and her friends all get separated. And Sylvia is, or I guess she joins, or is welcomed into a group of former Jasadi citizens that are in hiding. And together they're working to restore and clear the name of the Jasad kingdom. Also, Aaron is like off being like emo boy number 1, but trying to play it cool. Something that really saved the beginning of this book for me also was Sarah Hashem introduced a few new POVs, and they're POVs from characters we met in the last book, and honestly, the characters I liked better than the main characters in the last book. But it really helped save it because the characters were all split up in the beginning, so it made sure that no one felt too detached, and it also made sure that no plot was ever going on, like a side plot or a side character's plot was going on, that we were just told about on page and expected to adjust to that. Kind of like when, like I said, like sometimes I felt like they were falling in love in the first book a little bit off page. I wanted to see more of it on page. We got to see all of these characters' journeys on page, and then we got to see the really fun ways that they ended up eventually intersecting later on in the book. It also just added so much richness to those side characters that already had a lot of depth and heart. And like I said, I liked them better than I liked Sylvia and Aaron. And so we just got to get a little bit more background about them and their motivations, which kind of made the end of the book a little bit sadder than I think it needed to be. I already would have been sad about the end of the book, but it made it a little extra sad. However, the ending is a big part of the reason I didn't rank this book any higher than 3 stars, because it felt purely like it was for shock value. There was just so many moving parts. I think there was too many time jumps, and there was just too many time jumps at the end, and it was too many parts to end a book. It was like almost an epilogue to me. And it felt as though Sarah Hashem knew we as the readers wanted a happy ending, and she had a different ending in mind, like before the first, let's say, what I'm calling 3 epilogues occurred, or the 3 time jumps. She had an ending in mind, and I honestly think she should have just left it there, but I think because she knew readers would want a happy ending, she had to kind of take like a long journey to correct everything she had done leading up to this point. So it felt like some of the payoff wasn't really worth it. So I'm happy for the ending in terms of as a fan of the characters, but as a reader and like an enjoyer of the series as a whole, I think it lost some of its weight because of the last few chapters. But that was the Jasad Crown by Sarah Hashem. I would recommend checking it out. I really liked it. Felt very culturally informed, and I think the second book dropped a few plot points, like in the sense that they introduced these aspects of the culture and introduced these ideas, and they weren't really relevant to the plot as a whole, but they did make the world feel very rich, and I thought the world building was very well done. It just didn't always pay off as much as it probably should have in terms of the plot. So, backtracking a little bit now, because that was the 8th book I read this year. The 6th book I read this year was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mutar. And this book was highly, highly, highly recommended. I had it on my TBR for a little while, and I recommend going into this book knowing as little as possible. I rated it 4 stars. I'm going to give you a brief description, but I'm really trying to keep it as simple as possible, because I think the less you know, the better this book is. Through a series of letters that are left in increasingly strange and convoluted places, 2 rival time agents form a bond. That is all I'm going to give you. That is all the context that I would say I understood of this book going into it, and the payoff in this book is so good. I was very confused. I think I should probably do a reread of this book, because it wasn't really connecting with the story for the first half, maybe, but when you get to that second half, all those pieces that maybe were confusing or didn't seem important or seemed kind of frivolous in the first half just really come through. I think Carrie Can Read, who's the one booktuber I watch pretty religiously, recommended this book the most that I saw, but I saw this just all over the place. It deserves the hype it got or gets. Please read this book. I also think it's so impressive. This book is written by two authors, and I imagine, I didn't do too much research into this, I imagine they split the writing between the two characters equally, so like one was one character and one was the other. But it has such a clear voice that despite the fact that it was so obvious when you're reading these letters which character was writing the letter, but at the same time it just felt so intentional and seamless in the voice and tone of the book that I can't believe two people joined together to make this, but also I can because it is such a good, the characters are so distinct and so fully fleshed out. And another thing that really impressed me about these authors is the world building they did and how they still managed to leave room for reader interpretation. I feel like sometimes when I read books like this that have an alternate reality or a reality that is based a few years away from our own, they tend to get overly invested in the world building to ensure you truly understand their vision, and I sometimes get a little too caught up in the world building. I also do this in like fantasy books. Like I have a hard time looking at maps because then I'm so focused on trying to remember the map when I'm reading the story that I don't think I really get as much out of the story as I could have. Whereas here, I didn't feel bogged down by the details. They left a little description, a little bit, a little idea of how this time travel works, how this reality works, how the nuances and changing little moments, the butterfly effect almost work in this book, but then left room for you to fill in the blanks as you needed. It kind of gave you the structure of the building without filling in necessarily the floors and the furniture and the paint and all of that. I ranked this 4 stars, and I think I would have enjoyed this more as a physical book, and the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars is because of that beginning bit. I think if I reread it now, it would definitely be a 5-star book. I just also very rarely I very rarely rank a book 5 stars. I probably have like 2 or 3 of them in my recent memory, in my recent reading journey that I can think of. So it probably is a 5-star book, but I would want to reread it and sit with it another time before I make that determination. The next book I read was Scattered All Over the Earth by Yoko Tawada. This was another 4-star book for me, and I probably would have ranked it 5 stars, but the plot point that drew me into the book the most wasn't explored in as much detail as I expected it to be, so it did get bumped down to 4 stars. In this book, we are in a world where Japan no longer exists, and a former citizen of Japan and seemingly the last Japanese speaker, Haruko, creates a language known as Pan-Scandinavian, which allows her to communicate and be understood by people from a number of different countries. As interest grows in this new language, this homemade language that she's made, Haruko goes looking for another Japanese speaker with which to share her story. And kind of similar to Brooklyn, the discussions around identity and community that were brought up in this book were really, really interesting and almost snuck up on you, because at times this book feels like a very lighthearted, fun, found family almost sort of vibe, and then all of a sudden we're talking about loss and identity and what is it like to truly be the last of your people, and what is it like when you lose hope of ever finding another one, which is stuff Haruko grappled with. That's the word I'm looking for. Grappled with. What drew me to this book was the idea of the made-up language. I was hoping that would be more of a plot point, but it was more so mentioned that she's made up this language. We got a few brief tastes of it and people being impressed by it, but didn't really delve into the exact creation of it or anything along those lines. And I would have liked more specifics on that. I wouldn't say I'm a linguistics person, but I do like language. I am trying to learn languages. I think it's one of the most impressive things in the world is when someone can speak multiple languages. So I would have liked some more depth in terms of that plot point, but I understand why we didn't get it, and I really enjoyed the story throughout regardless. I also really like when characters' stories in like seemingly unrelated stories intersect, and in this book they intersect very early on, so you're not held in suspense for too long. But we have a few different characters and we all get their POVs, and they all end up at some point or the other on this journey with Haruko looking for another Japanese speaker. And in a way, they all raise different questions about those themes of identity and community and being the last of your people, and also present different solutions towards those issues. If you're even a little bit interested in language or the concept of losing your identity and home, I would recommend picking up Scattered All Over the Earth, Yoko Tawada. Next, I read The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins, and this realistically is a 4.75 star book for me. I ranked it 4 stars on Storygraph. So good. This is also another book I would recommend going into knowing as little as possible. There's a twist at the end that is so unexpected and pays off, so, like, all of it's just the payoff of it is so well done. My brief description is: a woman raised in an infinite library by a godlike man takes her destiny into her own hands. It is all I'm going to tell you going into it, because you need to go into this blind. There is no way to adequately describe this to you. Even if I gave you a play-by-play of the plot, I'd be missing so much that you can only get by reading this book. I also love when you have a main character that you don't necessarily like. The first book I ever read like that was Gone Girl, where I didn't like either of the two of them, but I so badly wanted to see how that plot played out that I devoured the book. In this case, our main character, I went from rooting to her to not agreeing with her at all to kind of being neutral towards her, and just the ability to be taken through all of those feelings about one main character that you're spending so much time with in one book is really impressive. And this felt to me like the adult version of playing outside as a kid, and you're imagining, I've got a wand and I can do magic and I'm a fairy prince or what. Like, it just felt so much to me like just playing outside and using your imagination to the fullest extent, but with adult level stakes and adult level themes. I think the only reason this wasn't a 5-star read for me was just it dragged. Just not even it dragged at the beginning, but again, it's so unexpected, and I went into it so blind that I just felt like I spent a little too long trying to find my footing. And you never really do find your footing in this book, but in the best way possible. But just because I was a little lost at the beginning, it took me a little while to get into, and when I got into it, I absolutely devoured it. But just that little bit of shakiness at the beginning for me bumped it down 0.25 stars realistically. Please recommend. This is definitely one of my top books of the year, and this also very popular because I had this on Libby hold. Like, this was on hold for, I want to say, 4 or 5 months. I was waiting a while for this book to come in, and I felt so bad when I first started reading it because I was having a hard time getting into it, and I was like, this is going to go off. Like, I'm going to I'm going to run out of time on my hold and then have to wait 4 more months. So I'm very glad that it picked up the pace and I got into it as quickly as I did. But don't do yourself a favor. Read The Library of Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. Now, remember earlier when we were discussing switching genre? This is a big switch in genre for me. The next book I read is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. And I never in a million years would have guessed I'd be reading a John Green book again. If you had told me that at the age of 26 I'd be picking up a John Green novel, I would have laughed in your face. I definitely read The Fault in Our Stars. I think I read Looking for Alaska, although if you ask me the plot, haven't the foggiest idea. And I think I read Paper Towns. Again, if you ask me the plot, haven't the foggiest of ideas. It's very possible I watched one of those movies, because I think they were both movies, and just got the plot from that. Everything is Tuberculosis, however, is a nonfiction where John Green seamlessly ties in the history of tuberculosis and its present-day implications with the lived experience of a young man in Sierra Leone named Henry. And he writes in a way that bleeds with hope for a better future, but also educates the reader and also demands for systemic change, because the long story short of it is that tuberculosis is a curable disease. It is essentially eradicated in the United States, but countries like Sierra Leone and countries that are not as well off as the United States, still, it is a debilitating, life-ending, life-altering disease. And we have a cure for it, and it's just not distributed equally. This book was very sad, but in a way that didn't make me feel hopeless. Like, I still felt hopeful, but just sad that these are still hurdles that we as a society and we as humankind have to overcome. This book is also just so full of personality, especially when John Green is discussing Henry, the young man in Sierra Leone that he met and befriended and spent so much time with. He uses Henry to bring almost a real face and real perspective to this faceless disease. And Henry, I'm sure as a person, is so personable and so engaging and is someone you want to root for. But having never seen him or met him or spoken to him, the way John Green presents him on the paper helps just elevate all of those qualities that he must possess. And it is, I don't want to say a cheap trick, it is an obvious trick, I believe, to use a real person to kind of tug on your heartstrings and make you care for an issue at large. But it is very effective. That is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I gave this 4 stars and I highly recommend it. I feel like memoirs and biographies are hard to give 5 stars to because they deal with real people. And while all the other books I read, I talk about how I love how grounded in reality they are and how they deal with these very real and present and pressing themes and motifs and tropes and whatever. When it's a real person telling you their story or a real person telling the story of a real person, it just feels like ranking it 5 stars is reducing the people to characters, and they're not characters because they're real living people. So that's just a little hang up I have personally. I think maybe if it wasn't a true story, it would have been 5 stars, but also if it wasn't a true story and didn't have the lived experience of Henry and the personality oozing off the page, it wouldn't have been as effective as of a book. So, speaking of 5-star books, however, the next book I read is my first 5-star book of the year, and that is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. And I would just like to start this review off by saying, why did nobody tell me this was an unfinished series? I still recommend you read it, okay? For support the series, because then they'll know we want to read the rest of it and it will come out. But I went into this thinking it was a standalone fantasy. Got to the end, well, I got close to the end, and I was thinking, I don't think everything's going to be wrapped up exactly in the way I would like it to be wrapped up. Then I got to the end, and guess what? It wasn't wrapped up. You know why? Because apparently this is going to be a trilogy. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself while I wait for the next 2 books to come out. Cry? Despite that previous complaint, I highly, highly, highly recommend this book. This is about a scholar in a king's court investigating a murder while the trials to choose the king's successor go on, and while she's investigating it, she unearths the core of a tragedy that cemented the king's reign 24 years prior. And when we open the book, we are learning about the tragedy that occurred and that cemented this king's reign. Then we have a time jump. I also love our main character. She's such an unconventional choice for a main character, but no one else could have driven this story. Like I said, she's a scholar, she's a black woman, she's not a warrior, but she's also not like a shirking flower that I think you would think a nerdy scholar woman to be. And it's not like she needed to find herself. She did need to step into her power and be more warrior-like, I'd say, but all of the things that made her an unconventional main character are all of the things that made her the character this story needed in order for the plot to progress and for the story to take place and unfold. I also just love when a story feels haunted. And this story is haunted by the opening scene. It really permeates the entire rest of the book with a sense of tension. And the story feels haunted not just by the events, but also a specific character from that opening. It also makes you root for our main character even more because the drive to resolve this tragedy at the beginning of the book, I think, permeates your heart and you want her to find justice, essentially. I think one of the greatest praises I can give this book is, as I mentioned earlier, there are trials going on to choose the successor to the throne, and I could not decide who I wanted to win the trials because they all presented such real and weighty pros and cons that it was really hard to identify which one of them was quote unquote the best choice. They all had different agendas and methods and tactics and alliances, and pure personality of the contenders aside, all of that background info was so well explained and shown in the story that I was really conflicted until the very end about who should win. There's also just a little touch of romance, like the perfect amount of romance for me in a book, and I could not put this book down. Such a page turner. It is all I thought about while I was reading, and I cannot wait to reread The Raven Scholar when the next book comes out, which is hopefully soon. Alright, apologies if you're watching this for the lighting and scene change. your girl got busy, okay? But book number 12 that I read this year is I See You've Called in Dead by John Kenny. And the plot of this is after accidentally posting his own obituary, Bud Stanley, a very alive newspaper obit writer, is suspended from his job. He begins attending the funerals of strangers with his friend Tim, and along the way he learns something about life. Mixed feelings about this book. I gave it 3 stars. It could have been very profound, but at the end of the day it felt very much like chicken soup for the soul type of vibe to me, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if I wanted to get that sort of messaging and that vibe, I would have just read Chicken Soup for the Soul. However, it did make me cry at the end. I think the core of the message was really, really good. I just think the way we took to get to that message, that final message, was a bit convoluted and unnecessary and almost uninteresting at times. I didn't really care for Bud Stanley as a main character. He's this like middle-aged guy. He's like reeling from his divorce, and the side characters were just so much more interesting, particularly his best friend Tim, which is the reason I cried at the end of the book. His best friend Tim is also his landlord, and Tim is wheelchair bound, I think because of an accident that he had when he was younger. Wheelchair bound, but just full of life. He hosts these parties where people in the neighborhood and their friends come and showcase the films they made, or they talk about art and music and all of those things. And I do suppose this was part of Bud's issue in life that he was having, where he was feeling kind of stagnant, leading to him, mock writing his own obituary and accidentally posting it. But he is the least interesting person in this group of people. And then also, there was a romance that was just so random and unnecessary, and there's other things Bud Stanley should be working on versus falling in love. And instead we're going to choose to dedicate some time to that. And also, his love interest was like corporate manic pixie dream girl vibes, which is, I don't even know how you create a character like that. But anyway, he runs into this girl and she's like, yeah, I'm attending the funerals of strangers. You should try it too. And he does. And I think if we had just spent the book with Bud and Tim and some more depth to that relationship, and for whatever reason they then decide to go to the funerals of strangers, it would have been much more impactful. Because at the end of the day, he realizes that he's feeling stuck in life, which is something he did not want to admit to himself, and everyone was trying to kind of everyone in his life was trying to hint towards him needing to grow up and move on and evolve as a person. So he did that by the end. I just think the path we took to get there was just, it was something. So I gave it 3 stars because I thought the message was good, and I really, really liked Tim as a character. I really liked his role in Bud's life. And then there's also this neighborhood kid that Bud talks to that I really like that character. It just was so, almost like so expected and so stereotypical, for lack of a better word, that, again, I could have just read Chicken Soup for the Soul, or, an advice column in a newspaper and gotten the same vibe. Thankfully, the next book I read was, in fact, Lucky Number 13, and that is The Second Death of Locke by V.L. Bovalino. V.L. Bovalino's work has been recommended to me before just by my Kindle, because I think I read books that are very similar in vibe to their work, but this was the first one I picked up. I think this also was recommended by Carrie Can Read, and again, watch her religiously. I trust her recommendations. And I gave this 4 stars. And this is about Gray, a magical well-to-Keir, her best friend and mage, and the lost heir of the Isle of Locke, who finds herself pulled into a mission with Keir to protect a girl claiming Gray's title. The two must decide how far they are willing to go to protect Gray's big secret and more secrets that they share. This book is what cemented for me that Friends to Lovers is superior, and it also cemented for me that I am not a romance hater to the extent I think I am. I feel like a lot of times in this video alone, I've talked about how I thought the romance was necessary. I thought the romance wasn't fully fleshed out. I didn't care for the romance, and that's true. I very often do not think romance is a necessary aspect to a lot of the stories I read, because I don't read romance heavy stories. I like a story that has a little bit of romance in it, if it makes sense, and if it does not detract from the plot. However, I feel for the most part, it very often does. This book, that does not happen. And you go into it knowing that they're going to fall in love, just being a reader and knowing the genre, that's going to happen. But watching them, one, be so blissfully or like so unbelievably unaware of the other person's feelings is fun. And Friends to Lovers, I think I realize I prefer it because it's I keep using the word grounded. It's grounded versus enemies to lovers, where I feel like a lot of that does have to rely on attraction, like immediate attraction, even though, because in enemies to lovers, you have to be like, even though I hate this person and everything they stand for, because you need, that's what you need to be true enemies. Kind of hot though. And I feel like we end up being willing to look past our grievances with the love interest because they're kind of hot. Whereas with its friends to lovers, it's, they already have this shared connection. I understand why they fall in love with each other. It's just waiting for the two of them to figure out that they're in love with each other. So friends to lovers is superior when it's done right. I think enemies to lovers has its place. I think, I don't know, strangers to lovers has its place. But friends to lovers, when done right, clears. Similarly to the Jasad Air, the side characters here were really, really well done. I didn't like them more than the main character or the main characters, but they really did steal the show. At certain points, they all had very like key roles in the plots in different ways. And even if it wasn't all happening on page, you realized how integral they were to the story and to Gray's character development overall. So I really liked that. And this book, writing wise, was very visceral. It was very detailed. It was fast paced, which I like. So sometimes I feel like these stories, especially in this story, Gray and Kier go on a journey with a couple other soldiers. And sometimes when you're on a journey in a book, it can feel like it kind of drags, or you don't spend enough time in the journey and it's just like, here's the start of the journey, here's the end of the journey. We got like content within the journey and like progress within the journey without feeling like we were dragging, we were like hung up in there too long. And I was really surprised with how much of the book, or how little of the book almost, was dedicated to the journey, because I thought that was going to be the main part of the book, and it really wasn't. That was just our vessel to get the story really and truly started. So I really appreciated that about it as well. Miss Carrie Can Read just reviewed the arc of the sequel to this, and it's not like a true sequel because it doesn't follow Gray and Kier and their friends, but characters from the second Death of Locke pop up in this book, and she recommended knowing the second Death of Locke going into the sequel. So I'm interested to check that out when it comes out, because I enjoyed the writing style of Via Bovalino, so I would want to check out more books by them, but I think I would maybe have an easier introduction to their writing, or easier foray into their writing, if I read something that's already related to something I read by them and like. But that was the second Death of Locke, B.L. Bovalino, 4 stars, I recommend. Immediately after that, we drop off. I read this next book 2 stars. It is Strange Houses by Uketsu. This is a combination of purely my fault and the writing, but I would say it's mostly my fault. 1, I think I should have read this book as a physical book. 2, I didn't really know the world of Uketsu's writing, let's say, going into this. Basically, Uketsu writes these books about houses with strange layouts, and like the layout and the floor plan of the house is a big part of the book. And the plot of this is a writer notices strange dead spaces in rooms in a floor plan and unravels a generational mystery. So because of the aspect of the floor plans being printed in the book and being like a major aspect of the book, I think I should have read it physically. I read it on my Kindle. Wouldn't recommend that if you're going to go into it, but I just did not care about anything or anyone at all, and the plot was just so ridiculous. Like, it was crazy because the writer has I think a former cop friend, but the writer has a friend, like the main character in this book, and both of them are theorizing about these dead spaces, and then and basically a missing persons case that is related to the house, and they come up with this crazy theory, and they're correct. It's like such an absurd theory, but they're somehow right, and it gets more absurd from there. So I can't say I recommend it. There is, my understanding is there is a very large following for these series of books by Uketsu. Give it a chance, but definitely do not read it digitally. Strange Houses. After Strange Houses, I remember that I was supposed to be trying to read 6 memoirs / biographies / autobiographies this year. So I read Death in the Jungle by Candace Fleming. And this is a thorough account of Jim Jones's rise to power and his eventual downfall. And I felt that this presented the facts in a way that was neutral and lent some credibility to Jones's followers. I feel like when we discuss cults, it's very easy to dismiss the followers of said cult as, oh, those people are crazy, that would never happen to me, how could you let yourself be tricked like that, yada yada yada. And the way Candace Fleming details Jim Jones's principles and ideals makes it understandable as to how people fell into following him. And then by the time he, I don't want to say became crazy, but showcased his level of insanity, or his brand of insanity, it was a little too late for them to leave. Now, my mom is from Guyana, so that is where the Jonestown Massacre happened, which is how Jim Jones's story and the story of his followers ends. And so I knew a little bit about the story going into it, but I thought this is a really good option if you want to learn a lot, like get a lot of depth about the story, because it doesn't just talk about Jim Jones's history, but it follows a few followers specifically within the organization, and also it begins from well before Jim Jones started his church to a little bit after the massacre. So if you want like a really holistic, detailed view, I would recommend Death in the Jungle by Candace Fleming. After that, I read The Bewitching by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and I gave this 3 stars, firmly a 3-star book for me. Told through the eyes of 3 women in 3 different times, this book follows a graduate student raised on stories of witches, unravels the mysterious disappearance of a college student, and tells the tale of a witch that ruined a young girl's life. This book is told in 3 timelines following these 3 young women, and I really liked the use of the multiple timelines. The only problem is because we had these 3 characters, one just fell flat for me, and that was, I would say, the main character, the present day timeline, the graduate student. It was just the weakest. I didn't find her to be a compelling or an interesting character. I didn't really... She lacked some personality. She was very much just a vessel through which... a vessel the story needed in order to be told. The other 2 characters, though, or the other 2 timelines, really, really interesting. I wish we had had more depth there and referred to the present day character a little bit less. She was just really necessary to tie everything together and kind of conclude the big bad villain. I also think part of the reason we had to spend so much time in the present day point of view is that a few too many plot points got introduced and the other 2 POVs that needed to get wrapped up. And I will say, Sylvia Moreno Garcia did a really good job of wrapping all of her points up, but I don't think they were all necessary or really all drove the story in the same way. So if we had just crystallized some of them, it would have been a bit more direct, it would have been a bit more effective, and then we could have spent more time in those 2 interesting POVs. It was a quick read, it was an interesting enough read. I would recommend it if that's your genre and that's your vibe, but I would just go into it knowing that not all POVs are created equal. The Bewitching by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, 3 stars. Next, I read what is undoubtedly one of my top books of the year, if not my top book for the year, and that is Songs for the Missing by Stuart Onan. I gave this 4 stars, and the description is: when Kim Larson disappears from her small town, her friends and family are left to grapple with the loss and the people they have to become in the face of such tragedy. This read like a memoir or like a biography. This felt so real and so present and so just, it was so beautifully written. I would recommend this book to everybody. It felt like you knew our main character Kim, but then you were doubting how well you truly knew her, because we spent a lot of time with Kim before her disappearance, which I really appreciated. It wasn't just missing girl and she's haunting the story before we ever really got to know her. We got to know her pretty well, and then she goes missing, and you're doubting these pieces that you read at the beginning of the book. Very much like her friends and family were doubting the Kim that they knew, because someone goes missing. As I think I said earlier in this video, it is impossible to know all of somebody, and how do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the version of them that other people knew and loved. I don't know how Stuart Onan did this, but Kim's disappearance read like a jump scare. It happened so quickly on the page, and even though you go into the book knowing she's going to go missing, the exact time it happens and the way it happens is just so, like, I think I gasped and I had to reread the page a few times. And it's not even as though we witnessed the disappearance on the page. It's just quite literally Kim is on the page one moment and missing the next. And it helped the book feel so real, because that's how disappearances happen in real life. Is somebody, you say goodbye to someone, they walk out their house one day and then they're never seen again. And it's horrible and it's traumatic, and that's how I felt reading the scene. And I thought it's really impressive how impactful that was, because we then spend so much time focusing on Kim's life and her community around her, and not the exact details of how she went missing and what she went through while she was missing. I'm not doing this book justice. Please go read it. Songs for the Missing, Stuart Onan. I went through a lot of highs and lows so far this year in reading, because my next book I gave 2 stars, and that is The Star from Calcutta by Sujata Massey. I'm going to keep this quick. This is about Perveen Mistry, who's Bombay's only female solicitor, and she's in the process of securing a big film client when a film censor turns up dead at a film studio's party. Torn between her client's interests and the pursuit of the truth, Mistry must navigate this unfamiliar industry while reconciling with her best friend, hiding her romantic relationship, and proving to herself to her boss, who is also her father. This is part of a larger series, is my understanding, about Perveen Mistry. So I think if I had known the series or known a little bit more about just the universe going into this, I would have enjoyed it more. But I felt lost, and I don't think, at the same time, I don't think you should rely on readers knowing your universe and its lore in order for a book to be enjoyable. And I wrote down that this is lacking Nancy Drew finesse. I read a lot of Nancy Drew growing up. I read every single copy of Nancy Drew my library had multiple times. You can pick up any Nancy Drew book and be immediately enveloped in that world. Even though we're referencing maybe cases or characters that have appeared in other books, even if you hadn't read them, you still feel equally enmeshed and like have a good understanding of Nancy Drew's life and world. I was not getting that here, and I didn't care enough about any of those people to be invested in their stories. And then also there was this running line of her brother and his wife that ran off, and the brothers got the baby, which again I think probably is something that was maybe significant in another one of the books. But just too many things. We spent too much time delving into things that really, in the grand scheme of the story that was being told in this book specifically, were not important. They might have been important to the universe as a whole, but not to this book. And I can only judge off of this book. So 2 stars. I apologize. Funnily enough, the next book I read also took place in India, and that is Black River by Nilanjana Roy. I gave this 4 stars, and I added it to my TBR after seeing Saif Ali Khan talk about it. He's a really big Bollywood actor, and he was discussing how he had bought the rights to the book in order to eventually adapt it into film. So I would like to see that. And the plot is, in the small Indian village of Tidapur, an 8-year-old girl is found murdered, and with her father and the community devastated, the 2 local police officers investigate the crime, unveiling the dark underbelly of their home. To begin with, you spend enough time with Munia, who's the 8-year-old girl that gets murdered, at the beginning of the book, to mourn her when she dies. Her murder happens on the page. You see it coming, and it is devastating, it is sad, and it's so unnecessary in the grand scheme of things, like the reason she gets killed. And somehow her death is the least interesting thing that happens in this book. It is obviously the catalyst for this whole story, but as the story goes on and her murder is investigated and the key players that are linked to her murder come to light, it's not background noise, because it is very present and very sad throughout the entire book, but there's so many moving pieces that result in the unnecessary death of this little girl that it becomes, again, it's somehow the least interesting thing in this book, which I think is really impressive to do because it was so impactful. I feel like in quite a few of the books I've discussed in this video, I've talked about how we spent too much time on certain details or on the past or this or that. In this book, it's almost the opposite. We have multiple POVs, and we spend a good amount of time in the past of each character, of each POV. We get to learn a little bit about their personalities and understand the reason they make certain decisions in the book, or the way they respond to certain things, and why that may be. So everyone in this felt really, really real, and a lot of times I feel like when characters feel real, it's characters that you like, you want to be friends with, they have positive characteristics. In this book, specifically the 2 police officers investigating the murder, I was so frustrated with them because they were making decisions based not necessarily on facts, but more on politics in this town and in Bombay. But I understood why they were making the decisions they were, and I understood how it interacted with the rest of the story in order for it to progress. Another book that I feel like I couldn't describe and do justice to, I would recommend reading this. It was a fantastic read. I did lose a little bit of nuance and maybe enjoyment of the book because there were some discussions around religion and religious discrimination that I maybe didn't understand fully just because of some of the terms they used in the book that I think maybe were more locally or culturally understood terms, specifically around Muslims. But at the end of the day, I did understand who was being discriminated against and the general gist of why, so it didn't really detract from the story that much. But I would highly recommend, if you were willing to read a sad book and be a little bit frustrated and upset and devastated, Black River by Nilanjana Roy. The 20th book I read this year was then Slewfoot by Brom. Brom apparently has got a big catalog of work. Had never heard of them before. This was fun but not profound. The plot of Slewfoot is an ancient malevolent entity known as Slewfoot becomes the widow Abatha's only ally in a fight for her land and her life against her pious neighbors. Remember in Competitive Grieving when I talked about comically insufferable side characters? The antagonist in this book is comically evil, so it was very easy to... It was like he was almost rage baiting me, but he was so easy to hate. It's Abatha's brother-in-law, because after her husband passes, her brother-in-law wants to take control of the farm that she lives on, and she's determined to work it and pay off her debt and own it free and clear. But again, it's a very pious community, very Puritan, and so he doesn't believe that women should have those sorts of rights, and that honestly Abisha shouldn't talk at all, and he wants to marry her off to his son eventually, to kind of give you the vibe of this guy. And on the other hand, Slewfoot, this malevolent entity, is somehow charming and nice, and you want to root for him. His motivations are ambiguous, and that's something Slewfoot is struggling with in this book. Is he good or is he evil? And kind of like we talked about in this video, different people's perceptions of one person will never all line up. Slewfoot is being told by one group of creatures who are claimed to be his children that he is this evil, malevolent entity. And Abatha's like, well, yeah, but you're helping me out. Like, maybe I don't love your methods, but in the day, you are doing me a service. And I think it's almost more compelling because he's a supernatural entity and not a real person. I feel like when you have morally gray characters, one, get it together. You need to figure out what side you're on. And it's not so charming when you're like a real person, but this malevolent entity who has lived years and years and years and seen things we can only comprehend or could not even comprehend is allowed to be a little conflicted about his moral standing. So I gave this 3 stars. It was a little not boring at times. It was just a little like, it felt a little formulaic, I'll say, but it was really interesting. And I wish the end wasn't so scorched earth. That's another reason I couldn't really rate it any higher. I hate when someone has a wrong perception of you and then the thing you have to do in order to save your own sanity proves them right, if that makes sense. And at the end of this book, Abatha proved all the awful things they were saying about her, and I understood why they had to. And yes, it was a little fun to kind of go on the joyride that we went on at the end, but I just don't like when evil, wrong people get to be correct. Even if they're not technically correct, they think they're correct. So, Slewfoot by Brom. Also, it had a lot of drawings in it, like at the beginning of every chapter, and at the end it had drawings of like the characters, and these are like these super creepy supernatural characters, and so I really like that. It helped add a very unsettling element to the book. And my mental image, because I only saw them after I finished reading, my mental image of the characters was actually not too far off from the real image, but Brom, or at least the artist, really upped the ante and made them very, very, very creepy. Slewfoot, Brom, 3 stars. After that, I read The Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton. Gave this 4 stars. Stuart Turton wrote the 7... Okay, guys, tell me what is the correct title of this book. Is it The 7 Half-Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, or is it The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle? I don't know. I read that book a little while ago, and I, for the life of me, cannot figure out. To me, I think it's The 7 Half-Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, but I'm not sure. So if anybody knows, please comment. But this is about Samuel Pepys, the greatest detective in the world, who is being transported across the ocean to be executed for a crime unknown to even his right-hand man, Arndt Hayes. But Hayes is sure of Pips's innocence, and he intends to clear his friend's name, but along the way he finds himself racing against the clock to solve a mystery tied to the devil himself that threatens the life of everyone on board, including the very one he swore to protect. This was an interesting book for me because I love a locked room mystery, and the majority of this book takes place on a boat. So how can this crime happen? How can I investigate this with my limited resources when we're on a boat in the middle of the ocean and my pool of suspects and victims is only so large? Also, Arndt Hayes, again, he's kind of like the brawn to Samuel Pepys's brains, so he's not used to investigating crimes. The one time he did, it went horribly wrong, but Samuel Pepys is locked up, so Arndt has to investigate in order to help also free his friend. Despite being off page for most of the book, Samuel Pepys is a character I can say I did not like. I didn't think he was very charming or appealing or any sort of way. Like, I understand he was like, he's so smart, he's kind of insufferable. But even with Arndt, who's supposed to be his right-hand man and essentially like his best friend, the person who knows him the best, you would think he'd be a little bit more considerate or a little bit more dimensional, for want of a better word. But I just did not find him interesting at all, and I didn't really care what happened to him. The only reason I wanted Samuel Pepys to be free is because Arndt wanted Samuel Pepys to be free, and Arndt was a very good character. He was a very compelling character. He was big and burly, but he kind of wore his heart on his sleeve almost. And he was also torn between Samuel Pepys and his uncle who's on the boat, and his uncle is the man who has accused Pepys of this crime. But he loves his uncle. So seeing him grapple with those emotions was really, really great. And then I really enjoyed the way he interacted with other characters. It made the other characters even more compelling to me. And we had multiple POVs in this book as well. And I thought it did a really good job of providing a different insights into the same topic, into the plot as a whole, without revealing too much, because every character is working with limited information or different information. So you as a reader got a pretty holistic view of what was going on, but still were left in the dark about a lot of things because each character was left in the dark in different ways. And I really loved the ending, not so much for the twist, because I thought the twist was ridiculous and absurd, and maybe I wasn't paying enough attention to the book, but didn't really feel grounded in the reality of the book at all. But that's neither here nor there. What I did like in the end of the book is there's a discussion around loss of faith in something you believed in and how you kind of reconcile that. And I loved that aspect of it. So I think the twist was good purely because of those emotions we got to explore at the end of the book, but not because the twist made sense. But I do still, again, like this better than his other work. So The Devil in the Dark Water, Stuart Turton, 4 stars. After that, I read what is, unbelievably, another 5-star book. That is The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. And chef's kiss. Okay, beautiful. I do think this was much more impactful because I read most of the book, got to a really crucial point, and then my Libby hold ended, and I had to wait another 8 weeks for it to come back off of hold. So just that anticipation really made it that much better for me. But I think you will also find this to be a 5-star read. The plot is, raised under the tutelage of a master con artist, Loch Lamora and his band of thieves perfect their skills in a fantastical city. While attempting to pull off their greatest con yet, the tightly knit crew find themselves in over their heads with a powerful stranger, intent to raze the city to the ground for reasons unknown. I love a little band of thieves. I love a little found family, a la Ocean's 11. I love a charismatic leader. Loch Lamora is just, he's that guy. He's who he thinks he is. Maybe my one complaint about the book is I felt like the city and the details of the city and the world building weren't super necessary to the story. A lot of times they talk in the book about how there was this society that existed before them and how they obviously had powers and they built these beautiful buildings with this thing called elder glass, I believe, this magical glass, and it glows and whatever. And then by the time the new society found it, these people, like, there was no trace of them existing except for these buildings. I didn't really feel like that played into the story enough for it to be necessary. I think we should have just stuck with the general descriptions we had of the city, which is kind of like Venice, and that it is magical in some ways, but we didn't need that much detail. But that's not even really a complaint because I liked the story. I thought it lent itself well to the story we were telling because you understood the scope of the magic in this world. And again, I love A Merry Band of Thieves. I was devastated. I cried. I laughed a ton. And there's one quote in this book that reminds me of a Sansa Stark quote. Locke says at one point to someone, "When you meet the Crooked Warden, tell him Locke Lamora learns slowly, but he learns well." And my favorite Sansa Stark quote is, "I'm a slow learner, it's true, but I learn." So, and I also thought it was interesting because George R.R. Martin was one of the reviews on the cover of the book. So, little melding of the worlds there. I love a book you can laugh out loud at. It's very rare I laugh out loud at a book. This was funny. This was like Percy Jackson funny, which is the highest compliment I could give a book in terms of humor. The Lies of Locke Lamora, Scott Lynch. Read it, read it, read it. There are other books in the series, and I'm almost afraid to read them because I don't want them to ruin my perception of this book. After that, I remembered I'm supposed to be reading memoirs again. So I read How to Say Babylon by Safia Sinclair. I gave this 4 stars. Safia Sinclair recounts her childhood growing up in Jamaica under the imposing arm of her militantly Rastafarian father. Safia Sinclair, from my understanding, is traditionally a poet. This just happens to be her autobiography. And I think you can tell she's a poet from her writing because I didn't want to put this book down. It was so compelling. She wrote so smoothly. It's just that every point flowed very well into the next. I had a hard time cutting myself off after chapters. Like I try to, when I read at night, finish my chapter and then go to bed, and I just wanted to keep consuming the story. It was so well told, and part of that obviously has to do with the events of her life, which she didn't have control over. I will say sometimes the characters, for want of a better word, in her story lacked some nuance, but I think she did a really good job of presenting her father, presenting her mother as these nuanced people, and you could understand her frustrations with her mother, which did come a little bit later in life. And along with coming later in life, I like how we saw her critical thinking or her perception of her life grow as she grew up. My example for this is when she's growing up, she's a little girl, she sees how women are treated or what's expected of them in Rasta culture.